Michael, Sarah, Tom, and Jessica, a group of friends eager to escape the hustle of city life, decided to spend the weekend in the wilderness. They pitched their tents deep in the forest, surrounded by ancient trees, and from the first moments they felt the serenity engulfing them. That evening, gathered around a campfire, Tom, who was always a fan of supernatural tales, brought up the subject of local legends. "Have you ever heard about the bottomless well?" he asked, his gaze slowly sweeping over his friends. "Locals say there's a well in these woods with no bottom. Everyone who's gone down there never came back." Michael, ever the skeptic and realist, scoffed. "That's just a scary story for tourists. Come on, Tom, be serious." But Jessica, who was fascinated by all things mystical, tensed up. "Where is this well?" she asked, her voice wavering with a mix of fear and curiosity. Tom smirked and pointed toward the darkening forest. "They say it's nearby. We can check it out tomorrow." Sarah shot Tom a disapproving look. She was always irritated by such topics but kept silent. The group spent the rest of the evening discussing the well, laughing and sharing their own scary stories about it. No one took it seriously, except for Tom, who had told the tale. The next morning, while the others were still asleep, Tom ventured into the woods. He was determined to find the infamous well and surprise his friends. But by midday, he still hadn't returned. Michael was the first to notice Tom's absence. His backpack was still by the entrance of his tent, and there was no sign that he had planned to leave. Initially annoyed at Tom's foolish stunt, Sarah soon grew worried. "We need to find him," Jessica insisted, wringing her hands nervously. "He talked about the well yesterday. Maybe he went there." The friends set off in search of Tom and soon stumbled upon an ancient stone well, covered in moss and vines. Nearby lay Tom's belongings, his jacket and flashlight, but Tom was nowhere in sight. Jessica froze, staring into the well's bottomless, dark void. "Damn it, Tom," Michael shouted in frustration, waving his arms. "Is this some kind of joke?" But all that answered was the echo of their own voices. Fear crept up on them slowly, like a fog wrapping around their hearts. They searched until nightfall. Suddenly they spotted a girl in the forest shadows, mud splattered, clothes torn, and eyes wide with terror. Jessica gasped, recognizing her as the local girl they had seen at a gas station on their way to the woods. The girl, covered in dirt and with scratch marks on her arms and legs, sat by their fire, hugging herself. Her body trembled with fear, and her eyes were empty, as if she were still trapped in some horrific place. Jessica, always the helper, sat beside her and gently put an arm around her shoulders. "What happened?" Jessica asked quietly. "How did you end up here?" The girl flinched but said nothing. Her lips quivered as if she was trying to speak, but no words came out. Sarah, standing nearby, frowned. "Maybe she knows what happened to Tom." Sarah snapped, unable to bear the tension. "We've been looking for him all day, and he's still missing. This is just insane." But Jessica sensed something was terribly wrong with this girl. Finally, the stranger spoke, her voice faint and barely audible. "They're down there," she whispered, staring blankly into the fire. "I saw them. Those shadows. They were moving in the darkness. I don't remember how I got there, but they were watching me, hunting. I could feel their cold hands. They were trying to take me." Jessica squeezed her hand, but the girl continued, as if unaware of everything around her. "Their faces, so empty. They drain your fears, your thoughts. Tom, the guy you're looking for, I saw him. But he's not him." Her words left a chilling silence in the forest. Michael stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "We need to go back to the well and find him. This is just some weird story." He paused, staring at the darkening sky above the forest. "This is impossible." But doubt had taken root deep inside them. The legends they had laughed off the night before suddenly felt all too real. They all realized that their next step could be fatal. The night in the forest stretched on endlessly, and the well seemed to pull them closer, its bottomless darkness luring them with promises of secrets better left unknown. Michael took the first night watch, but soon dozed off by the fire. Sarah and Jessica climbed into the tent, trying to shield themselves from the mounting terror. Sarah fell asleep quickly, but Jessica couldn't force herself to close her eyes. Every time she tried, she saw something horrifying, formless shadows, silent whispers, as if they were coming from the well itself. And when she finally drifted off, she dreamed of a nightmare. She was standing at the edge of the well, peering down into its endless chasm. The water below glimmered, reflecting the moonlight, but something was off. As she leaned closer, she saw her reflection, but it was distorted, as if someone were trying to rip it from the glassy surface of the water. Her own eyes stared back at her with hatred, and the reflection's hands slowly rose, as if reaching for her soul. "Come to me," the reflection whispered, its voice cold and metallic, yet eerily familiar. "You're next." The reflection's hands gripped the edges of the well and began to crawl out, trying to drag Jessica down. She staggered back but felt cold fingers brushing against her skin, pulling her into the abyss. With a scream, Jessica jolted awake. Her heart pounded as if it would burst from her chest. Darkness surrounded her, and the campfire outside the tent was nearly extinguished. Sarah was still asleep, but Jessica sensed something dreadful, as if unseen hands were reaching for her again. She stepped out of the tent and looked at the forest. The trees, usually so majestic and serene, now seemed like living beings, waiting for her to make a mistake, ready to swallow her whole. In the distance, the well shimmered in the darkness, beckoning her to return. The night deepened, heavy with despair. Michael, after much thought, suggested they split up. Sarah and Jessica would stay by the well, while he and the girl who had escaped its depths would go for help. He was sure they would find a way out, though everyone felt the tension mounting. "We need to find Tom," Sarah whispered, looking at Michael. Michael clenched his teeth, his patience wearing thin. "So what's your plan?" "Wait here until Tom comes back on his own. We've searched everywhere nearby and found nothing. We need to get help. I can't just sit around." The girl, who had just escaped the well, remained silent, hugging herself and glancing nervously at the trees, as if expecting them to come to life and attack. "Stay here," Michael commanded, heading toward the forest path. "We'll be back soon." Sarah nodded, though her eyes were full of worry. Jessica said nothing, her gaze fixed on the well, as if it held the answer to their nightmare. Michael and the girl entered the forest, but their path quickly became strange and confusing. The trail that had seemed familiar blurred and vanished into the shadows of the trees. Every step brought a sense of déjà vu, as if they were constantly passing the same place. The forest seemed to trap them, as if the very ground beneath their feet was spinning, leading them in circles. After a while, Michael realized they were returning to the same spot they had started from, the well. "Why are you back? Did something happen?" Sarah asked, surprised to see Michael. "No, we walked straight along the path, but somehow we ended up here. What the hell is going on?" Michael replied in bewilderment. "What do you mean? Are you saying we can't get out?" Sarah responded, her voice tinged with anxiety. "I don't know," Michael whispered. "It's the well." The girl who had escaped out of it suddenly said, trembling in fear, "It won't let us leave." Suddenly, Jessica heard a voice coming from the well. "Jessica." The familiar but distorted hiss echoed from the depths. "Jessica, help me." Tom's voice. But something was horribly wrong with its tone. It sounded like a distant echo, filled with something inhuman. Jessica felt a cold terror creeping up her throat. She turned to the group. "Did you hear that?" But everyone was silent, their faces frozen in expressions of horror, as if Jessica's words hadn't reached them. The wind howled around them, and the forest seemed to shudder. The darkness grew thicker, as if it were gathering around the well, pulling them into its black abyss. Tom's voice didn't stop calling, pulling her toward it, filling Jessica's head with a strange, chilling fear. She began to doubt whether she was the only one hearing it, or if everyone else did too. The whisper was so vivid and insistent that it couldn't be ignored. "Save me." "Jessica, I'm here." The voice called again. Jessica slowly approached the well. Her legs felt like lead, and her mind was clouded. She felt something unknown calling her from the darkness, making each step heavier and more agonizing. But as she took a step closer to the well, her mind was pierced by a horrifying vision. She saw Tom, but not as he was before. His eyes were empty, and his body was twisted, as if his soul had been ripped out, leaving only a shell. He stood at the bottom of the well, surrounded by shadows, reaching out his misshapen hands, begging her to save him. "No," Jessica whispered, recoiling, and heard a loud whisper behind her. She turned around. Michael and the girl who had earlier escaped the well were gone. Sarah was also not where she had been a moment ago. There was no one around her, only the shadows of the forest, moving as if they had a life of their own. Their whispers grew louder, becoming a nightmarish chorus of voices calling her name. "You must come," they whispered. "Come to us." Left alone, Jessica realized there was no way out of this forest. The well was calling her, and the whispers from the darkness grew louder, penetrating her mind, forcing her to take step after step toward her nightmare. Jessica stood at the edge of the well, breathing heavily. The darkness that filled the forest seemed to thicken around her, pressing on her mind. She knew there was no escape. Sarah, Michael, and the girl who had escaped from the well, they had all disappeared, as if taken by the forest itself, just as it had taken Tom. The well was the final point where all her fears converged. The whispers, the shadows, the distorted figures, they all lurked in this abyss, waiting for her to make a move. Jessica felt the rising panic, like cold fingers reaching for her heart. She knew her mind was on the brink, but with that realization came another. If she wanted to save her friends, if she wanted to survive, she would have to descend into a place from which no one had ever returned. The well exuded an ancient menace. Her mind conjured grim images of what might be hidden at its depths. She remembered the horrifying stories of people who had vanished here without a trace. But reality around her had already crumbled. All that remained was to step into the abyss and embrace the darkness. She heard a faint moan, turned around, but there was nothing. The forest was like a dead thing, not a single sound, only the well, silently and insatiably calling her. Thoughts of her friends, of those she had lost, whirled in her mind. Death or salvation. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew there was no other way. Her fingers clenched on the cold, rough edge of the well. She leaned over, peering into the depths. Nothing. Only bottomless, hungry darkness. And in that darkness, something moved. Jessica couldn't see it, but she felt as though something below was staring at her intently, craving her. The whisper, sinister and quiet, seeped into her mind. "Come. You must come." Suddenly, something seemed to push her, and she began to fall into the depths of the well. In her mind flashed the thought that this was the end. When she finally touched the surface of the water in the well, she immediately lost consciousness. Jessica suddenly awoke on a cold, stone floor. Regaining her senses, she looked around and saw she was in a place that resembled an ancient tomb. The darkness here was absolute, as though even light could not reach these depths. She felt the chill seep through her body, as if each step down tore her from reality, pulling her into something else. Around her, walls stretched, rough and wet, but they seemed to move, to breathe along with her. Every step forward, every brush of her hand against the slick stone gave her the feeling that she was walking through something alive. The darkness grew thicker, as though it surrounded her, turning her thoughts into chaos. Suddenly, a figure flickered before her. She stopped, holding her breath. Tom. His face appeared in the air before her, but his eyes were empty, as if he were no longer human. He reached out his hand to her. "Tom," she cried out, but his image vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. It was only the beginning. Barely had Jessica taken a few more steps when other figures appeared before her. Michael stood motionless, his body twisted as if something had torn him apart from within. Sarah stared at her with a deranged expression, her eyes deep and dark like the well itself. "This isn't real," Jessica whispered to herself. "It's just an illusion." But something about these figures felt real. All the darkness, the strange visions, invaded her consciousness, consuming it. She was losing her sense of time and space. The ghosts of her friends circled her, calling her name, but each one looked more mutilated, as though their bodies and souls were torn apart by the entities hiding in the shadows. Step by step, she descended deeper. She no longer knew where she was or where she was going. Time ceased to exist. Jessica felt the walls blur around her, and soon she found herself in some other place, a world filled with shadows and twisted memories. Shadows moved around her, and every whisper, every motion made her mind crack. Her friends called to her, but she no longer knew if they were alive or just illusions. Jessica walked through dark corridors, hearing muffled moans and cries. Her heart beat in time with the growing horror as silhouettes appeared ahead. She recognized them, they were her friends, but something was off. At first they seemed merely exhausted, but as she got closer, the truth became clear: they had changed. Sarah, who had disappeared last, sat on the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. She slowly turned her head toward Jessica, her movements sluggish, like a broken doll's. But this wasn't the Sarah she knew. Her skin seemed to merge with the darkness, as though the well was gradually consuming her. "Help me," she rasped, reaching out her hand. Next to her was the girl who had escaped from the well. Her eyes were full of terror, but her lips didn't move. The entities from the abyss had made her their puppet, devouring her mind alive. The rest of her friends fared no better. Tom was already fused with the dark walls, his face twisted in agony, while Michael begged her for help, his voice trembling with fear and pain. Jessica froze. Her friends were trapped. She could see their suffering, feel their pain. But what could she do? Free them? Or abandon them for her own survival? The well awaited her decision, feeding on her uncertainty. Her mind screamed that there was no salvation, but her heart broke at the thought of leaving them behind. "Jessica, you have to leave," Michael whispered, his eyes filled with despair. "We're not human anymore. The well won't let us go. Save yourself." Tears blurred her vision. She realized they could no longer be saved. This place had made them part of itself, stealing their souls. Clenching her fists, she turned and ran forward, leaving her friends behind. The whispers and screams pursued her down the corridor, but she couldn't turn back. The well demanded sacrifices, and now she knew those sacrifices were her friends. The darkness around her grew denser, swallowing Jessica whole. Every step echoed, as if the space around her was mocking her. Rooms and hallways began to appear, distorted reflections of the world she knew. But these were not just places, they were filled with her past, with fears she had tried to forget. She stepped into the first corridor and saw herself as a child, standing in the corner of a room, crying and trembling. It was the memory of hiding from her father, who pounded on the door, shouting in a drunken rage. The fear of his cruelty was so overwhelming that her legs buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping as if she had returned to that very day. "This isn't real," she whispered through clenched teeth. "It's just the past." But this place seemed to sense her weakness, dragging everything to the surface, laying before her the memories she had been running from all her life. She saw the next door, and her blood ran cold. There was blood on its walls, and she knew what lay behind it. It was the thing she most wanted to forget. When Jessica was a teenager, she witnessed a car crash. The vehicle had slammed into a tree, engulfed in flames. The driver, a middle-aged man trapped inside, burned alive. She had tried to help, but there was nothing she could do, and that moment haunted her every time she closed her eyes. She saw him again, his screaming, charred figure, burned almost to the bone, as if it was happening right here and now. The man reached out to her, his eyes filled with pain and accusation. "You could have saved me." His voice was soft, but it echoed in her head, tearing at her soul. Jessica screamed, backing away, but the wall behind her began to warp as well. She stared into the eyes of her own fears, and the harder she fought, the more her past surrounded her. They were draining the life from her, filling her mind with endless terror. The well hadn't just lured her here, it knew her. It knew her weaknesses and used them to break her. She ran through the hallways, fleeing from one scene of her past into another, but every turn was a trap. Shadows, screams, faces of the dead and the living, all blurred into a ceaseless nightmare. But this cursed place didn't want her dead. It wanted more. At the end of one of the corridors, Jessica suddenly stopped. Before her was a vast dark hall, pierced only by faint glimmers of light. There was nothing here that resembled her memories. This place was alien, distorted, as if it existed beyond her reality. But she could feel she was not alone. From the darkness, entities began to take shape. They had no distinct forms, constantly shifting, sometimes resembling people, sometimes animals, and sometimes something entirely unrecognizable. Their movements were silent, as though they didn't belong to this world. These beings seemed more like shadows, but their presence was palpable, almost physical. They fed on the fear emanating from her. With each step she took, the shadows became clearer. She heard whispers, indistinct but full of suffering. Jessica realized that these entities were not just figments of her mind. They were real. They hunted those who dared to enter the well, and now they were hungry. One of the beings drew closer. It had no face, only a blurred, smudged outline of a head, but she could feel its intense gaze, studying her fear, her pain. With every passing moment, it drew nearer, its dark, cold fingers almost brushing her skin. Jessica was horrified to find she couldn't move. She was paralyzed not just by fear, the darkness itself held her in a vice-like grip. She tried to fight, her mind screaming to run, but every step forward seemed to pull her deeper into this endless madness. The well was not just a place. It was a prison for souls, for those caught in its trap, and the creatures here thrived on it, on suffering and pain. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices. They were trying to make her lose control, to succumb to panic, to give in. And though her mind was on the verge of breaking, she knew the only way to escape was not to yield to these monsters. But how? Every move she made brought her closer to insanity. The entities began to circle her, their bodies shifting into the forms of her friends, then into warped images of her past. They whispered in her ear, luring her deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, from the depths of the shadows, an entity more terrifying than all the others emerged. It was the abyss itself, without form, with countless malicious eyes watching her and mouths murmuring an unbearable cacophony. It was the true master of the well, its heart and mind. "You have come." The creature's voice was a whisper, chilling and sinister. "You are stronger than the others. Your will to survive brought you to me." Jessica stepped back, but there was a wall where none had been before. There was nowhere to run. "You want to save yourself? I can offer you a deal. I will let you go." The creature slithered closer, its shadows snaking across the floor. "If you give me your memories, everything you've seen here, and those you knew, forget your friends, forget the well, and you will be free." Her mind was fraying from exhaustion, fear, and despair clinging to her. She could hear the voices of her friends, their suffering. She knew she had to fight, that she had to struggle to the end. But how? Her mind was already at the breaking point. "I won't do it," she whispered, but her voice wavered. The creature chuckled, a sound fracturing into dozens of voices. "You no longer believe that. You're tired. You see, the girl who left this place before you, she agreed. And you will too. It's because of that deal she remembers nothing. Or rather, she wasn't supposed to, but meeting you brought the well back to her, partially restoring her memories, breaking our deal. So I brought her back here." The darkness began to seep into her consciousness, filling every corner of her mind. Jessica felt reality warp, the walls of the well closing in around her, blurring the boundaries. The creature assaulted her mind, filling it with images of suffering, terror, and hopelessness. She could no longer tell where reality ended and madness began. "Give them up. Forget, and it will all end." The creature invaded her thoughts, tearing down the last of her defenses. Every part of her screamed to resist, but she realized a grim truth. The only way to survive was to agree. Her heart sank as she understood that refusal meant complete insanity. Clenching her fists, Jessica lowered her head and whispered, "All right, I agree." The darkness engulfed her, draining the last shreds of her memories, taking the images of her friends, the screams, the suffering. Everything vanished as if it had never existed. Her mind was freed from the pain. When she opened her eyes, she was on the edge of the forest. Jessica stood among the trees, surrounded by silence. She couldn't remember how she got here, who she was, or what had happened. Only a faint sense of unease gripped her chest, but she couldn't understand why. The well remained hidden deep in the forest, waiting for its next victims. Her life began anew, but the darkness always lingered at the edge of her mind, whispering that one day it would return.